Recently, I've been seeing the resurrection of a pretty outlandish argument against the Filioque. I've heard this many times before, but recently it was brought to my attention again by Ubi Petrus against the greatest, most charitable, most nuanced YouTuber, the infallible interpreter of the magisterium, Michael Lofton. And I also saw our good friend, Mr. Orthodox Luigi, have a tweet on this as well. So I thought it'd be nice to just do a video to kind of shortly address this. So what is this weird argument that I keep mentioning? This argument is basically meant to counter a very common argument that gets brought forward by Catholic authors. Often, unfortunately, Catholic authors are kind of afraid to go in and to discuss what the Cappadocian Fathers teach, or St. Cyril teaches, or even St. Maximus or St. John of Damascus. They don't want to treat those authors or ante-Nicene authors because they seem not clear enough. So what they'll do is they'll basically put an argument like this. The argument goes, if the Latin Fathers taught the Filioque, then the Filioque is true. The Latin Fathers taught the Filioque, therefore the Filioque is true. Personally, I really like this argument, but this argument does require a little explaining. We have to answer certain questions about indefectibility. Could the entire Latin Church after a certain date fall into a heresy? How long could they have fallen into a heresy? And so on and so forth. But even with all this explaining, it's not a half-bad argument. Now, usually what Orthodox will do is they'll concede that the Latin Fathers actually erred on the Filioque.
And so Saint Fulgentius, I would say, is aside from Saint Augustine, is the only other father I will say that that probably has a Filioquist bent.
Now, what they'll do to justify their dissent from the Latin view of the Filioque is they will say that the East didn't teach the Filioque. And then they will point to the central role of the Cappadocians in the development of Trinitarian theology in order to justify a Cappadocian supremacy over some of the Latin Fathers.
Yeah, when we're considering presuppositions, I was mentioning earlier the reading one set of fathers in light of the others, or reading the other in light of the former. It seems to me that we should read, it seems to me, at least when I was thinking of coming to terms with that, and you guys can disagree with me if you want, but it seems to me that because the Cappadocians their theology was the foundation of the Trinitarian doctrines of Constantinople I, and
right.
It seems to me that we should be reading the earlier Latin fathers before Augustine in light of their theology.
I agree.
That's my take.
No, I think that's how we should read Hilary, for example. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Now, ultimately, I don't think it's right to point to this East versus West tension on any doctrine, especially as important as the Trinity. But this requires a lot of discussion about indefectibility, which is an issue of ecclesiology, not an issue of Trinitarian theology. So it's not really in my wheelhouse. So usually what I'll do to this argument is I'll simply say that the Cappadocians didn't disagree with St. Augustine. But there's a different way in which the Orthodox can disagree with this. Whereas the ordinary way in which Orthodox will respond to this argument is by attacking the major premise, that is, if the Latin Fathers teach the Filioque, then the Filioque is true. On the other hand, there's other Orthodox that will attack the minor premise, that is, that the Latin Fathers even taught the Filioque. Now, it's this argument that I think is quite strange. But in another way, I actually think this is the more consistent way for Orthodox to go about this. These Orthodox will legitimately argue that the Latin Fathers, some actually include St. Augustine among them, did not teach the Florentine Filioque, but actually taught a version of the Filioque that is reconcilable with Eastern Orthodox dogma. While I, of course, think this is a very bad reading of the Western Fathers, I do think this is more sensible for them to actually do. And I think there are three important reasons, although I can think of a lot more, for taking this position. But before we continue, remember that if you like the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/militantthomist. It really helps me out, and you get access to more streams, articles, etc. First, we can look at the praise given to the Latin Fathers at First Constantinople. We further declare that we hold fast to the decrees of the four councils, and in every way follow the Holy Fathers, Athanasius, Hilary, Basil, Gregory the Theologian, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Theophilus, John Chrysostom of Constantinople, Cyril, Augustine, Proclus, Leo, and their writings on the true faith. Second, we can look at the praise given to St. Augustine in Eastern Orthodox liturgies, which actually especially points to his anti-Arian Trinitarian writings, where he teaches the Filioque. Who can fittingly hymn the labors wherewith thou didst toil throughout the whole church, cutting down ungodly heresies with the sword of thy corrections, denouncing the Arians, casting down the Manichees, exhorting the Donatists to return to the Orthodox faith, crushing the audacity of Pelagius, and planting orthodoxy, until thou hast assembled many children in the habitation of the church, and, instructing and guiding them, didst lead them to the mansions of heaven. The third and most important reason has to do with the letter to Marinus by Maximus the Confessor. The Orthodox will often use this letter to get around directly engaging with the Latin Fathers and having to explain all of the texts wherein they teach the Filioque. Let's look at the relevant section to the letter of Marinus. With regard to the first matter, they, the Romans, have produced the unanimous documentary evidence of the Latin Fathers, and also of St. Cyril of Alexandria, from the sacred commentary he composed on the Gospel of St. John. On the basis of these texts, they have showed that they have not made the Son the cause of the Spirit. They know, in fact, that the Father is the only cause of the Son and the Spirit, the one by begetting and the other by procession. But they use this expression in order to manifest the Spirit's coming forth through him, and in this way to make clear the unity and identity of the essence. The important phrase in this section is that word cause right there, when it says, they have not made the Son the cause of the Spirit. On the one hand, the Greeks will interpret cause in the sense of principle, or that from which something flows. So really this would be read as, the Latins do not say that the Spirit flows forth from the Son as from a principle. Now this would clearly contradict the teaching of the Council of Florence. On the other hand, the Latins argue that this word cause, or idea, is in the same sense as the Latin word auctor. Auctor basically means the primordial source of something. I explained this reading and the reasons why this makes sense in my debate with David Erhan if you wanted to check that out. But basically, when you look at the parallel usages from St. Maximus, I would argue that it makes more sense that the Latin reading is actually the correct reading. But that's not important right now. What's important is that the Greeks will often simply assume their reading of this text and then say, well, he says that the Latin authors did not teach the Filioque. Therefore, the Latin authors did not teach the Filioque. Now, if by direct engagement with the Latin Fathers, they see that the Latin Fathers didn't teach the Filioque, then they have a problem there. Either on the one hand, they'll have to concede that their reading of the letter to Marinus is actually wrong, and we're right, which means that St. Maximus is a supporter of the Latin view of the Filioque, or on the other hand, they'll have to take the insane view that St. Maximus actually didn't know what he was talking about when he reported the view of the Latin Fathers. And what makes this even more interesting is that he actually says that the Latin Fathers agree with St. Cyril. So with our reading, not only would St. Maximus be arguing that the Latin Fathers agreed with the Filioque, and not only would St. Maximus himself be agreeing with the Filioque, he would also be saying that St. Cyril agreed with the Filioque. But let me simplify this point to make it a little bit clearer. First, you have to ask whether the letter to Marinus condemns the Florentine view or not. If you say yes, then you're in trouble, since he states that he agrees with the Latin view. So in order to preserve this as an argument, you either have to say that he got the Latin view wrong, which would be crazy due to his exposure to Latin theology, or you would have to say that the Latin Fathers didn't actually agree with Florence. So what Ubi Petrus and some others do is bite the bullet and say that the Latin Fathers didn't actually teach the Florentine Filioque, which is an impossible hill to climb and requires metric tons of cope. On the other hand, if you are one of those Orthodox who concede that the Latin Fathers actually didn't teach the Filioque, you're in even more trouble. Well, if the Latin Fathers teach the Filioque according to the mind of Florence, and St. Maximus says that the Latin and Greek Fathers agree on this matter, then St. Maximus is defending the fact that the Greek Fathers taught the Florentine Filioque. And this isn't a situation that the Orthodox want to be in. So, on this, they are trapped between a rock and a hard place. This is why I say that the letter to Marinus is actually a great argument for the Latin position. But now that we have that out of the way, let's see what Ubi has to say about this.
Yes, these figures believed in a Filioque, but did they believe in the Florentine Filioque? According to Dr. Suchensky, whom Lofton brought in as a support, the answer is almost certainly not, and it would be anachronistic to assume they did. The fact is, there are various versions of the Filioque, and Mr. Lofton, who loves to wax poetic about the need for nuance, fails to show any of said nuance.
So he takes the route of simply stating that when Catholic apologists quote the Latin Fathers, they are simply assuming hypostatic procession, and this, of course, is fair enough. It is within the possible domain of the phrase from the Son that it means something else than a hypostatic procession. This is granted. So what we need to do is we actually need to argue about the sense of the passage. And how do we do that? We look at context, we look at parallel usages, and we look at the general argument and the way in which the argument progresses. Now, of course, when we actually do this, we see that they teach the Filioque, and the Filioque that is defined at Florence. But in order to give you a taste of this, I will just use one glaringly obvious example that was basically accepted in the entire West. And this example is the Pseudo-Athanasian Creed. The reason that I use the Pseudo-Athanasian Creed isn't because I think it's from Athanasius, but because of its wide and early acceptance in the Latin West. So we can say that this pretty accurately represents what the Latin Fathers would have affirmed, would have believed. I think this is much better than giving an example from a single father, or from a pope, or from a council. Rather, it's giving something that was affirmed universally before the schism. If you want to look at the history of the spread of the usage of the Athanasian Creed, check out J.N.D. Kelly's book, The Athanasian Creed. Ultimately, the earliest time that we see the Athanasian Creed used is actually by St. Caesarius of Arles, who was one of the foremost Augustinians in the early church, a very strong disciple of St. Augustine and defender of his views on everything. And the reason we know that St. Caesarius used it, and St. Caesarius actually uses it in one of his homilies, and assumes that at his time, it was a creed that was known. Thus, the creed was used in the West since at least the early 6th century, well before the time of St. Maximus the Confessor. There are actually many cases of 6th century ecclesiastical use of the creed by local synods. Kelly brings forth this example. Recared, king of the Visigoths, included in his allocation to the Third Council of Toledo in the year 589, at which he formally renounced Arianism. After this point, the Athanasian Creed ended up being used in the consecration of bishops and also in the office of prime during the daily office. If you want to read more about the history, definitely read the Kelly book. But my point is that it is a very early expression of Latin Trinitarian faith, which by the time of St. Maximus the Confessor would have been a very good representation of the Latin view. And it was something that was professed by Latin fathers, theologians, bishops, councils, and even popes during the pre-schism era. So the question that we need to ask is, does the Athanasian Creed actually teach that the Son is the hypostatic principle of the Spirit? Or is it possible that it teaches something else? What I want to do is I want to read the important section and then give some reasons for why the reading is correct. Now, the reason that I'm doing it this way, rather than bringing forth 100 different quotes from the Latin Fathers like I could do, I want to show you guys how a close and careful reading of one of these texts by the Latin Fathers can decisively conclude what type of filioque is actually being spoken of. So let's get to it. The Father is made of none, neither created nor begotten. The Son is of the Father alone, not made nor created, but begotten. The Holy Ghost is of the Father and of the Son, neither made nor created nor begotten, but proceeding. First, I want you guys to notice something. There are 3 affirmations based on the 3 persons. It starts off each time by denying that they are created or made. Of course, this is the case with all 3 of them, since they are not creatures. Then, after this, it tells you what those persons are of. So the Father is of none, the Son is of the Father, and the Spirit is of the Father and of the Son. So it starts off with the Father and says that, in equivalent terms, he has the property of inashability. That is, he is of none. Then after this, it goes on to the Son. It denies that the Son, like the Father, is inashable, but actually says that he is begotten of the Father. So what's the purpose of this passage stating that the Son is begotten of the Father? Well, the passage is actually telling you what the Son is constituted by. It's constituted by being begotten. That's what it means to be a son. Before, it told you what the Son wasn't. The Son wasn't created. The Son wasn't made. The reason it brings forth that the Son is begotten is it wants to tell you what the Son is, what constitutes the Son. Before, it said that the Father is of none, neither created nor begotten. Now it wants to tell you what the Son is. So obviously, when it's using the language of begotten, it's clearly speaking about the hypostatic origin of the Son. It isn't talking in terms of economy. It isn't talking in terms of some sort of manifestation. It's simply stating the eternal hypostatic origin of the Son. So this is going to be extremely important when we consider the sense of the third affirmation. So it goes on to say that the Spirit, just like the Son and the Father, neither created nor made, but then it denies that he is begotten. It's denying that that is his hypostatic origination. He is not simply begotten of the Father like the Son is. Rather, there's something else that constitutes him. That is, that he is of the Father and of the Son. So when we keep in mind what the context is, we keep in mind what the parallels are, we keep in mind what the purpose is, it's very clear when we read the Athanasian Creed that the Athanasian Creed is affirming the hypostatic origination of the Spirit from the Father and the Son. It's not speaking of the working out an economy. That wouldn't make any sense in what the purpose of the Athanasian Creed is. It's not talking about some sort of manifestation. That wouldn't make sense of the parallels with the Father and the Son. Rather, it is simply stating what the Spirit is hypostatically. There's also a second thing to notice, and I kind of mentioned it before. And this is basically that the entire passage is not at all about any sort of economic relation of the Spirit, or of the Father, or of the Son. This is not talking about the economy of the persons. This is simply talking about what constitutes the persons. It went on a long exposition of the unity of the persons. Now it's telling us what distinguishes the persons. That's the whole purpose of the passage. So it would make absolutely no sense, not only from the parallelisms that I went over before, but also from the purpose of the passage to randomly start talking about the eternal manifestation of the Spirit. And also, what makes this reading unlikely is that there's simply an omission. If, let's say, they did break the parallelism and brought up the eternal manifestation of the Spirit from the Father through the Son, and they put that in those terms, they didn't actually tell us what the hypostatic origination of the Spirit is. That would be actually omitted in the creed. It would only be telling us about something else. So, one could argue that this is something that's being brought up. The author might have thought that it was something worthwhile. But if he did bring that up, he would obviously also state what the hypostatic origination is. In their reading, it would be something completely missing from the text. So from any sort of plain reading of the text, with attention to the parallels, with attention to the context, we can also look in the reception of the Athanasian Creed as well, if we wanted to. But basically, it's pretty clear that this is teaching the Filioque beyond any sort of reasonable doubt. And this is the Filioque which is taught at Florence. This is a representation of what the Latin Church teaches from very on and very universally, well before St. Maximus the Confessor wrote about what the Latin Church believes. So you have to ask yourself the question, did Maximus the Confessor get the Latin view wrong? If you say no, then I have to ask you another question. Did Maximus the Confessor teach the Filioque? If you say no, then you're in a big, massive contradiction. If you say yes, then you can actually not only read St. Maximus as understanding what he was commenting on, but also read the beautiful harmony between the Eastern and the Western Fathers that was saw before us by our Holy Father, St. Maximus Confessor. Now, I could do the same analysis with other texts from St. Hilary, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, St. Fulgentius, St. Isidore, Pope St. Leo, Pope St. Gregory, and so on and so forth. I could do all that analysis if I wanted to. But what's clear is when you do things like I just did, and you look at the context, the parallels, the ordinary usage of terms, and so on with all of these Latin fathers, they very clearly teach the same thing. That is the same Filioque that was affirmed at the Council of Florence. But before I close off this video, I want to state something that I've stated a few times before. But this is a common method that's used by many Orthodox apologists. Catholic apologists also do things like this. But basically, it's the mere stating or mere infusion of doubt into the mind of the hearer. They will simply state some sort of narrative that seems plausible on the surface, but won't stand up to criticism. What the purpose of this narrative is this narrative is meant to get around a difficult objection. But what you guys need to be careful about, what you guys have to do, is you guys have to be careful not to simply state these distinctions or to simply state this narrative. You actually have to go into the texts themselves, or at least demand that the one bringing forth these narratives is going into the texts themselves and demonstrating their view from the texts. Because I can guarantee that there is not a single text from a Latin father, especially a Latin father after St. Augustine, that denies unequivocally the Florentine view of the Filioque. And I'd bet my life on that. So you have to demand that they do the hard work, and they exegete passages from St. Augustine's De Trinitate, or they exegete passages from St. Fulgentius's anti-Arian works, or St. Isidore's etymologies. You have to demand that they exegete those passages. They explain them in context, in accordance with the argument, in accordance with the common use of terms. You can't simply let them state narratives. That's not how it works. But what you will see is that they often will refuse to do this. Rather, they will simply hide behind a certain reading of St. Maximus the Confessor's works, which itself is not interpreted due to the ordinary laws of hermeneutics. And ultimately, they're refusing to do the hard work in order to make a rhetorically effective statement of the matter. Anyways, as always, God bless.